Okay, continuing with gender and aggression, lecture 17, part 2, we are going to dive a little deeper into precarious manhood theory. So, Precarious Manhood and Aggression, that's the title of a paper by Jennifer Bosson and her colleagues, in which they argue that manhood is more precarious than womanhood. And as a result, men have to prove and defend their masculinity more so than women have to prove their femininity, and men often resort to violence to achieve that goal. Why precarious? Theorists working within a variety of disciplines, including anthropology, sociology, psychology, and political science, point to manhood as a social status that's both elusive and tenuous, meaning it's hard to achieve masculinity and hard to keep it. The elusiveness lies in the fact that the transition from boyhood to manhood is, to quote Bosson's paper, not a natural condition that comes about spontaneously through puberty, but rather it's a precarious state that boys must win against powerful odds. In other words, manhood is viewed as a status that is earned via the passage of social rather than biological milestones. And then similarly, the tenuousness of manhood lies in the fact that once earned, the status can be lost relatively easily via any number of social transgressions or perceived failures. So you're beginning to see how precarious manhood theory maps really well onto that documentary, The Mask You Live In. So how do we know that precarious manhood theory resonates with the public? For example, Bosson had people in Florida answer a series of questions about how manhood could be lost. And she collected responses that were very diverse. They included he could lose his job, fail to provide for his family, act like a coward, act like a woman, and letting others down. It just seemed like there were myriad ways that men could lose their manhood. How could womanhood be lost? It was really hard for people to think of answers. The only two she found people coughed up were have a sex change operation where you literally switch from being a woman to a man, or maybe losing your breast to cancer. And then furthermore, men and women agreed equally strongly with statements such as manhood is hard won and easily lost, manhood is something that can be taken away, manhood is not a permanent state because a man might do something that suggests he's really a boy, and manhood has to be initially earned and repeatedly demonstrated. So these items subsequently became part of Jennifer Bosson's precarious manhood belief scale. So in other words, men are taught to be insecure about their masculinity because it is something they need to chronically prove. Prove it again. Prove it once, not enough. Prove it again. Consider phrases that boys and men hear all the time. Be a man or don't be a wimp. There's so many of them, and the documentary was great for pointing that out. Now, what happens to women? The best female equivalent is act like a lady, but nobody tells a woman to be a woman because that is what she permanently is. And even if men are lucky and there's no one in their life to undermine their masculinity by telling them to man up or boys don't cry, et cetera, the entire advertising industry is always there to remind him. So in San Francisco, I was at a conference and I walked into a subway and there were huge signs reading "This Way to Manhood" in addition to these. Do you recognize the company? It was a nationalized campaign. It's Dockers, and you can pause the video here and take your time reading the verbiage that they are trying to sell pants with. But the basic idea is that men have been emasculated by things like lattes and eating salad, and so they're trying to get men to think about themselves as men, right? And of course, if you wear Dockers, somehow that magically restores your manhood. And then if you take a look at how manhood is advertised to men, you have to notice that it's used to sell products that otherwise might not be viewed as butch, like Dockers or other kinds of clothes, but also things like cologne or milk or getting an HIV test. And then we get to weaponry. Bushmaster Firearms slogan, "Consider your man card reissued," is attached to their AR-15 rifle. And that's the rifle that Adam Lanza used to murder 20 children and 6 adults in December 2012 at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newton, Connecticut. And then that same automatic weapon was used by mass murderers in San Bernardino, Las Vegas, Orlando, Florida, and by Nicholas Cruz, who killed 17 people at Marjory Stoneman High School in Parkland, Florida in February 2018. Frankly, there's just too many of them to list on one slide. It's a very popular weapon that mass shooters tend to reach for. Is it always men? Well, the FBI examined active shooter incidents between 2000 and 2016, and they found that only 9 of the 220 incidents involved female shooters, which is less than 1%. So the U.S. doesn't really have a gun problem so much as we have a fragile masculinity problem. Why is it that manhood is perceived as an impermanent state whose legitimacy can be called into question fairly easily? I mean, why doesn't puberty do the job for men the way it does the job for women? Historically, boys became men through social rituals that include competing in status hierarchies, such as public demonstrations of physical strength and dominance. In primitive cultures, still the norm is outlined in a great book, if you have a chance to read it, Rituals of Manhood. So why do boys have to go through these rituals? Well, the advantage, I guess, is the ability to mate with many more women. It's good to be the alpha male. The downside is that a man might win, but given that such hierarchies are never fixed, men's position within them could at any moment be challenged. You're the winner today, but tomorrow you're a loser. And as a result of this precariousness, men may have a preoccupation with achieving and maintaining social status, along with a heightened sensitivity to cues indicating either a genuine or a potential loss of status, as well as a belief in the precariousness of their social standing. Sounds like a recipe to drive half of our population a little bit nuts, right? Moreover, men's competition for wealth and status is largely conducted in public spheres, whether we're talking about sports contests or political races. Men's achievements and losses have traditionally been highly visible, making men who lose easy targets for rebuke. So how does this lead to aggression? Well, Baasen and her colleagues argue that the most effective strategies for proving your manhood or restoring it are those that involve risk-taking to signify that you're brave and fearless, are difficult and therefore hard to fake, and are public and thus visible to others. So public, risk-taking, difficult tasks, that sounds like aggression, right? Or at least it fits the bill nicely. Furthermore, physical aggression is a prime trait that stereotypically separates men from women. So if you're tough or violent, you're definitely a man and not a woman. Therefore, demonstrations of physical aggression are part of men's cultural script for maintaining and restoring a gender status that is troublingly precarious. So you're Jennifer Baasen, you've come up with precarious manhood theory. How are you going to test this idea? Because does it hold weight when you put it to the test? Well, seems pretty obvious, right? Threaten men's gender identity and then see how they react. If they respond with more willingness to aggress in order to restore their manhood, that would be pretty good evidence. And several studies suggest this is the case. For example, using the feminine knowledge test we talked about before, the one that I invented, Jennifer Bosson threatened men, they were University of Florida undergraduates, by giving them bogus feedback that they'd scored high on the feminine knowledge test, whereas other men in the control group were told actually they scored low. In response, threatened men punched a bag harder and did more push-ups than unthreatened men. You can put a sensor on a punching bag that measures how hard it was hit. And then also using word fragment completion tests, men who were threatened, who had their manhood threatened, also showed increased accessibility of thoughts related to physical aggression, like gun, blood, and punch. Specifically, when their masculinity was threatened, men completed word fragments such as these with words like gun, blood, and punch, rather than sun, brood, and lunch, which were words that were more commonly thought of by unthreatened men. And the accessibility results correlated with how hard they hit the punching bag or how many push-ups they did. So in essence, when you threaten men's masculinity, you're priming them to think about violence, which then in turn can translate to behaving aggressively. In a different study, men were assigned to do, remember that hairstyling or rope braiding task, right? So braiding, it's the same behavior, it's the same skill, but if it's done as hairstyling, men think of it as feminine. If it's done as rope braiding, obviously it's thought of as masculine, right? So some men did the hairstyling task and some did the rope braiding task, and then after that, Jennifer gave them a choice of activities to either punch that punching bag or shoot hoops in basketball. And among men in the no threat condition, i.e. who braided rope, only 22% wanted to punch a punching bag, but men who had done the hairstyling task and therefore might be considered to be doing something feminine, more than twice as many of those guys, 50%, chose to punch a bag. In a totally different study with different researchers, the experimenters told some men that they had scored as high feminine on a bogus personality test. And those men subsequently reported stronger support for U.S. military interventions in Iraq and Iran compared with men told they had scored high mask on the personality test. So threatening men's masculinity has consequences for society as a whole, as well as for individual men and victims that they might seek to aggress against. And then other research shows that precarious manhood can impact the harmony of male-female relationships. In one study, men whose masculinity was threatened using that bogus personality test engaged in sexual harassment by emailing graphic pornography to a female confederate. In a different study, in a different lab, similarly threatened men were more likely to endorse domestic abuse and blame the female victim of domestic abuse compared with unthreatened men. And then another research tactic is to present a scenario in which a man's honor is attacked and then have subjects rate the appropriateness of a violent response. For example, Bosson presented a situation in which a man attempts to seduce another man's girlfriend in a bar. What should the offended man do? Men more than women thought it was justified for him to fight the seducer to teach him a lesson. Thus, it seems aggression is expected of men whenever their manhood is publicly threatened. And as a result, it seems more accurate for us to say that society has a fragile masculinity problem rather than an issue with toxic masculinity.